In this lesson, we will talk about pharmacodynamics, receptors, agonist and antagonist. First of all, what is pharmacodynamics? Pharmacodynamics is the study of biochemical and physiological effects of drugs and their mechanism of action. In other words, it actually includes what drug actually do to our body, like what are the effects, like therapeutic effects or toxic effects in our body, and how they produce these effects. So according to the pharmacodynamic principle, most of the drugs should interact with a peptide or protein known as receptor inside the body to produce the therapeutic effects. And as I said, the receptor could be different types. Receptor could be an enzyme. For example, NSAIDs, the non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, which we use as analgesics. So these drugs target one kind of enzyme known as cyclooxygenase enzyme or COX enzyme. So for NSAIDs, COX enzyme is that receptor. For other kinds of drugs, the receptor could be a channel protein. The channel proteins usually open, the ligand-gated channel proteins, they usually open by binding to a drug. So when the drug binds to this receptor, the channel protein opens and it allows the flow of ions. One of the example could be varenicline or Chantix. This drug is used for smoking cessation, and when it binds to the nicotinic acetylcholine receptor, it activates the channel, the sodium channel opens up. And then another kinds of receptor could be transporter. A transporter, like one of the example could be fluoxetine. Fluoxetine is an antidepressant drug. So this drug acts by inhibiting the reuptake of serotonin. So it binds to the serotonin transporter to inhibit the reuptake of serotonin into the presynaptic terminal. So that's why it's also known as selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor or SSRIs. Another kind of receptor could be structural proteins like tubulins. One example is colchicine. Colchicine is the drug which will bind to tubulin or the structural proteins of the cells. The receptors even could be cytokines like TNF alpha, interleukins. Some of the monoclonal antibodies have been developed. So these are the biological products, biological drugs which can target this cytokine. Example is infliximab, which is an anti-TNF alpha monoclonal antibody. And some of the drugs actually can also work without the help of any receptor. So those drugs could be like antacids, like aluminum hydroxide, magnesium hydroxide. So these drugs don't bind to any receptor. Another example is osmotic laxatives. Osmotic laxatives like mannitol, they can increase the amount of water content in the bowel without binding to any receptor. And another interesting thing about is that not all the receptors are actually present in our body for any drug. For example, like antibiotic drugs, they target the bacteria. So these bacteria could be coming outside of the body, like when we are infected. Like antiviral drugs, they also target the viruses which we are infected with. So they are not part of our body. So they are targeting something which is not actually part of our body. And when these drugs or drug molecules bind to the receptors, it can lead to transmembrane or activate the transmembrane signaling mechanism, which we are not discussing here. We will discuss here is what is agonist, what is antagonist. So Usually when a drug that activates the receptor to produce any biological response, we call the drug as agonist. But if any drug which can inactivate the receptor, then we call the drug as antagonist. And some of the drugs, they may act like an agonist. They can activate the receptor but not to the fullest extent. In that case, we call them partial agonist. So when we combine agonist and antagonist together, so it can lead to a different kinds of effect. So like the agonist drug and antagonist drug given together can nullify their effects. For example, in case of opioid overdose, like the morphine bind to a mu opioid receptor. So if we have overdose, then the patient may go into coma and ultimately they can die out of respiratory depression. To reverse this process, we have an antidote which is a mu opioid receptor antagonist like naloxone. When we give naloxone, it will bind to the same active binding site of morphine or the opioid overdose drug, so which will ultimately reverse the activity of morphine or the opioids. Okay, so in the next lesson we will focus on dose response curve.